Video brought to you in the King and Pawn Endgame series. This is a basic series for beginners to help them to first learn and then hopefully master basic King and Pawn ending concepts, all the way up to more complex King and Pawn ending opposition ideas. So hopefully you've watched the first video, King and Pawn Endings Basics. This is King and Pawn Endings Stage 2. Now, you may have noticed the basic concept of opposition from the first video doesn't seem like a very practical one, given that the kings are in exactly perfect position for the enemy or you to simply grab opposition, and either you work your way up the board toward king on the 6th, pawn on the 5th, or they have opposition and the game is simply a draw. But already in an endgame where a pawn is only on the 2nd rank is not quite the most practical position. It's a very important position and a very important technical concept for you to master. But now we're going to start looking at things that are slightly more practical and hopefully applying these same type of opposition ideas. The first one again here is a distant opposition position, kind of a tongue twister, distant opposition position. The basic concept is, what do you do when the kings are far away from each other? You know that you want to reach the position with your king eventually, your king eventually on the 6th rank, but just moving to get rid of the arrows. But how do you do that and still dictate the opposition? Before I give you the answer, I'm going to let everyone think for a few minutes. You can go ahead and pause the video if you want. Okay, assuming you paused the video and took a few minutes to think, which again, as I've recommended, is probably the best way for you to assure that the ideas from these series stick with you. Apply a little bit of yourself. You don't have to, but here's the concept. Most of you likely calculated the simple idea of the king coming up. You saw king e2, king f7, king e3, king e6, and white gets king to e4. Here's what it would look like. White simply grabs opposition. Well, that's awesome. The king will go in front of the pawn, and if you're really good, that means you mastered the first video, and you know that in this position, you have to take opposition with the king. Obviously, this would be a draw, giving him opposition, breaking our rule. So we take opposition, and then we start making progress, and the game is over. So that's good that you calculated the basic idea of coming up and eventually getting opposition. However, there is one major problem with distant opposition, and that is, even if you did a good job and calculated both kings coming forward, what you may have misunderstood is that the king does not have to come straight forward and give you opposition. He has the ability to make a waiting move, to sidestep. And this way he is avoiding giving you opposition and preparing to take his own opposition regardless of the square that you may take. Even if the king sidesteps away from the pawn, you can see that we have to either maintain and let him stay in front, or eventually break this rule of equaling the same rank to the king, which we know is no good for us. Eventually we'll have to push the pawn forward, and if you remember the basic concept that he can stay directly behind the pawn, he will always be ready to take opposition. So you can review that, but again, I'm not going to repeat it too many times because it's basic, and we have other things to move on to. But the main idea you need to remember is that he can maintain a distant opposition by making a waiting move. So, before we just give up on this position, there is one way for white to make progress, and a very, very important concept that's going to help us as we move on to more difficult things. That is, we'll put it this way. If the king were already directly in front of the pawn, either on the E, D, or C file, the position would be a draw. That's your clue. So taking that advice and looking at the position here, maybe you can think about what that clue means. Go ahead and take a few minutes. Okay, we're hoping you've done that. The idea that white can execute here to take advantage of the king's position is to come to the side of the pawn, the hallway, as we said, that helps the pawn move forward, that avoids direct opposition from the king. By coming this way, you see that his ability to make a waiting move does not make a difference because he is unable to reach the square. One very important piece of advice that I haven't heard said too often, only a few books have used this concept. I believe that Secrets of Pawn Endings, which is has a foreword by John Nunn and is by Mueller, which is a great book. Recommend it, Secrets of Pawn Endings. I believe that they sort of execute or display this phrase and this idea that I think helps a lot as you start to solve much more complex king and pawn endings. And that is that when calculating distant opposition, try to remember that the only way for an enemy king to hold distant opposition is on a direct file or a direct rank in some cases. It has to be a straight line. If he's trying to prevent you from, let's say, making progress toward one way, he can maintain on a direct rank. But diagonal opposition does not work for the defender. Diagonal opposition, a move like this, does not work for the defender. And that is because white can move forward and take the square as if he just had this position. He can move forward and take the square as if he were just in a position where he had opposition on d6 or d4, the king moved, and we sidestepped. Here, if the king comes up, we take the square, and white is already in position to help the pawn move forward. King and pawn working together. Eventually, we reach our goal of king on the 6th, pawn on the 5th, and the game is over. So, distant opposition, a very basic form of distant opposition, is what we see here. Calculating the ability for not only your opponent to perhaps make a waiting move, you cannot forget this idea, where the game is now a draw. He's prepared to take opposition. But also calculating your opportunity to evade this distant opposition and this waiting move idea by coming to the side of the board that he is unable to maintain direct distant opposition. Distant opposition can only be used on a direct file or a rank. The diagonal opposition does not work, okay? In almost any position without exception. The only exception would be if there were tons of pawns on the board, which in reality would not be a really traditional king and pawn ending where those concepts was applied. So, one thing I did mention was that if the king were already here on a direct file, it would be a draw. Just to prove that point, chess is not like football. One player can't like juke this way, move his whole body and trick the black king into moving and then actually let go of the piece over here. It doesn't work like that. Right? You must make the move. The king takes opposition. Now we must come forward in some way, giving him distant opposition. Actually now giving him direct opposition. And the game is a draw. So see that again. It's unlike another sport. There is no juking. You must make a decision, and he will maintain distant opposition. So as we said, this position is a win because of the king's inability to get direct distant opposition on a file as long as the white king knows to come this way, whereas this position is a draw. To clear one more point up, what if we had this position, but the white pawn was still on d2? Well, now you see that the idea of distant opposition waiting moves, the ability to make a waiting move, does not only apply for the defender. Let's say that he holds this distant opposition, holds it, ready, if you go here, he's going to go here, and if you go here, he's going to go to d7, thinking he has his distant opposition. In this situation, white's ability to make a waiting move with the pawn will then reset the opposition to be in white's favor. You see how tricky these things can get, which is why you need to go through these slowly if you don't know king and pawn endings and make sure you master the concepts. Your ability to solve a king and pawn ending will affect your ability to solve many other endings. Said it before and I'll say it again. So, we saw distant opposition, the defensive idea of making a waiting move, which you cannot afford to miscalculate. You must always expect the best move from your opponent. Now we see the ability to make a waiting move can also apply to the position of the person with the pawn. He makes that distant opposition, feels like he's holding the situation down, but in reality he's not because of our ability to make a waiting move. So, there is distant opposition in its purest form. Our next step, irregular opposition, is the next basic concept to understand. In this situation, we learned that opposition can also apply even if the kings are never directly opposed. That's why we call it irregular. Hopefully at this point, as I've said, you've done the first video, you understand basic opposition in its purest form. One square apart, he simply moves, you take what he's given up. Obvious and efficient, and you make progress. Then we see distant opposition, which is very important for calculating practical positions. Your ability to dictate the timing of who gets opposition, which is what distant opposition is all about, making those different types of waiting moves. Now we see irregular opposition. The basic concept is that the kings will never be directly opposed in this endgame, but white will be completely winning. You can take a few minutes if you want to see how white wins this. I'm assuming you're going to pause your video, and now we're going to move forward. The king simply moves to d6. And if you try to calculate this in your head, which I recommend you do on a regular basis, in fact, I have a rule with my private students, as some of you know on here who watch my videos, that I do not allow the pieces to be moved when we study chess together, whether online or over the board, until at least a serious effort, if not the entire position, has been solved. It's good practice for your studies, and it builds good discipline, because in a real game, players tend to make the moves too quickly where they actually had the ability to see the position further. So hopefully you're ready to jump on board for that, hopefully. And now we're going to see king to d6, king to f8, king to e6, king to g7, king to e7, king to g8, king to f6, king to h7, king to f7, black plays king to h8, and white plays king takes g6, winning the pawn. And if you know that king on the 6th, pawn on the 5th always wins, then you know you've already reached a goal position. Here's what we just looked at. We saw king to d6. He has to move, irregular opposition. He wishes he could say pass, but he can't. Then we make progress on one square. He has to move, we make progress on another square. He has to move, we make progress on another square. He has to move to guard the pawn, we finally make progress here. He moves, and we take the pawn. The kings have never been directly opposed in that situation, but he is unable to prevent us from making progress. Hence the term irregular opposition. And it starts to teach you the concept, just to remind you that this position wins even when it's your move. Real quick, king on the 6th, pawn on the 5th always wins, because the timing works out. And you win. This starts to teach you, irregular opposition starts to teach you the basic concept that opposition is really all about square control. At first we see it as a tool that we only apply to the kings. We see that the kings oppose each other and take the square that he's given up, but it's really about the pieces at that point. Then you start to see that opposition is ultimately about square control, okay, because there are major tools, advanced tools that we eventually use to get the opposition. If opposition is a tool we are learning right now that helps us get that goal of king on the 6th, pawn on the 5th, let's say, that wins, eventually we learn tools to help us get the opposition. Okay? So, before we move on to the next position, I'm going to make a trick here for you. What if I add a pawn here for white? A lot of people would say, okay, Danny's finally lost it. How can that possibly be more difficult? But, in this situation, there is a new feature. And that is, if white simply comes forward and pushes, we will be reaching a stalemate position. Now you can try to trick. Some of you who may already be familiar with ideas of triangulation may try to make some weird moves with the king, trying to trick and gain some sort of opposition, thinking that you're changing the timing of the position. But because black only needs to guard one square, which is essentially as soon as you go to e6, he must go to e8. There is no triangulation. What I just said is something you're going to forget, but as we get to very advanced king and pawn endings, which we will by the end of this, your muscles will be built and we'll be solving difficult positions. You'll be very proud. But as we get to those more advanced positions, you're going to forget this phrase, but I'm going to remind you how important it is what I just said. Triangulation does not work when the king only needs to guard one square. Triangulation only works when the king has to guard 2 points of entry or 2 weaknesses. Okay, you remember that phrase, it doesn't mean much to you now, but that will mean something as we move on. So that ability to make a triangle and try to make some sort of weird timing, some sort of timing and difference doesn't make a difference. You see, it's an imaginary triangle. The only way to win this endgame is actually to sacrifice the pawn. Simply give it up, force him to take it, and guess what endgame you're in? The one we just solved. Keeping that in mind, that as we move forward, I may be giving you difficult positions, and if you're really trying to improve, you will try to solve them in your head before I give you the answer. Okay, if you really want to ease that process, there is always a process between knowledge and application of what you know. So if you try to invest your time and energy into something as you're learning it, you're much more likely to maintain memory of that. Whether you like to hear that or not, that's the truth. As soothing as my voice sounds, and I know it sounds really wonderful to you guys, it's not good enough. I'm just joking, of course. But seriously, you got to apply yourself. So with that knowledge, we did distant opposition. Now we've done a basic irregular opposition. We added a practical feature. What if I move it over a step and we look at a position where the same concept applies, but we are closer to the edge of the board. Does this change our evaluation? You can pause the video if you'd like to solve it yourself. Here we go. The evaluation is changed, and hopefully your intuition noticed it immediately. Even if you have the ability to make progress here, what you will notice, let's say you have the ability to make progress with that same sack, what you will notice is that you are dealing with a corner pawn. So white actually does have the ability to make that sack and still use irregular opposition, by the way. You do have that ability. The only problem is that your goal is a mute point. The goal is not a real goal because it's a corner pawn. And as we already discussed, it's not winning. Very important practical trick to know. I have even seen grandmasters, and I will give you a position, blow situations like that. This was a rook ending I saw at the Chicago Open one year between two grandmasters who will go unnamed for the purpose of the witness protection program. As white came forward, he has a simple choice. Basically, the starting position was actually this one. White has a choice to just start moving over and convert to the king upon ending, or play this move g7, which would prevent any progress from the rook. In fact, it would prevent any movement from the rook because white can simply sacrifice this pawn, and after the trades are made, the pawn queens. But instead, he simply came forward as the game was winding down. He expects his opponent to resign. But when this trade was made, two more moves were made, and the game was agreed to a draw. White instantly realizes his horrific blunder and that he is just transposed into a theoretically drawn ending, because the position is either stalemate, or as we said, the pawn is sacrificed in order to allow the irregular opposition, but it doesn't matter. This position with these two pawns, if the king reaches this square, or anywhere stopping the queen, is a theoretical draw. Good to know, right? Okay. Now we move on to the position that was featured in our preview picture, and that is a famous position known as the king dance. Okay, here I'd like everyone to take a few minutes to think about the evaluation of this position. It is white to play, and what exactly would you like to do in order to play in this position? Are you better? Are you worse? There are some practical features that would suggest one line of thinking. But it is white to play, and I will let everyone make some of their own decisions. I'd like you to think about who's better here and why, what white would play, and how you see this position going. Okay, so go ahead and take a few minutes to do that. All right, now that you've done that, here we go. Rock and roll. Buckle up, Buttercup. This position is very important because it's like a climax position. In fact, when I first start with a new student, oftentimes I will give them this position. It's like a test position. You can either refer to it as like the daddy of some of these basic concepts we've just been learning, or you can refer to it as the baby of getting into real king and pawn endings, where there's actually real calculation involved and multiple different lines of play. This position is a draw with best play for white, but the majority of the moves here lose. Now, if you really calculated a critical line, you may have actually tried to see a way where white can win. Before we go into that line, let's see what happens if white plays most simple play, tries to activate the king and come forward. Do you recognize this position? This is the flip side of the position we were just looking at. Black simply takes this square, and you will see that irregular opposition is executed until black is going to win this pawn. Irregular opposition. White cannot prevent black from making progress. So, if we can't move this way, you can start to eliminate other king moves, any other passive king moves, because you establish that if this pawn reaches this square, you're going to have a hard time preventing him from coming forward. Even if he has to do the long route of irregular opposition, you're still going to get killed in the long run. So you start to see him more aggressive. Perhaps I'm assuming you did a good calculation. So maybe the next step you would have done was calculated an aggressive move. The idea of perhaps coming around the pawn. Now, the idea of this position that's tricky is that if black plays king to e3, white plays king to g4. And now who wins? Zugzwang for black. So black must avoid this square. So he dances. Now, if white plays king to g4, black plays king to e3. And now it's white's in Zugzwang, so he dances. But the person who wins the king dance is always the person who started out with a more active king position. The black king reaches the rear of the pawn, forcing the king to take the square that he doesn't want to, and black simply backs up to the square that he could have gone to for 3 moves, takes the square finally, and white is in 6-1. White moves the king, the pawn is lost, and white can resign. Whether the king was here or in Chinatown, as we already displayed, king on the 6th, pawn on the 5th, or in this case, 3rd and the 4th, wins no matter what. So look at that position. This is the king dance. Both sides are dancing. It's a regular opposition, avoiding the key square, as white would win. But eventually, because of black's more active king, he reaches the rear of the pawn, forcing white to occupy this square, and black wins. Very important concept to not only become familiar with, but I would suggest you master and memorize everything from this video, as again, we will be continuing to move on and discuss further complicated positions. The king dance is, like I said, a climax where you start to anticipate irregular opposition. Your opponent starts as well as your own. Now, I've just shown you all the king moves. I said the position was a draw, did I not? So what's white's only move that draws? The last move you would consider, simply sacrificing the pawn. By giving the pawn up, and then as long as you don't play the one blunder, which is king f2, you make a move with your king to wait for him to take it, white has a draw by force. Hopefully you understand that because you've watched the other part of the videos. White has opposition. Black will have to eventually push the pawn first, which we know is breaking that all-important rule. And eventually we will reach a draw because white will come straight back from the pawn and reach a stalemate by force. So, hopefully you've enjoyed these first 2 videos, and we will continue to move on. And for beginner players looking for a place to master some of these concepts that you can find in books such as Secrets of Pawn Endings, Fundamental Chess Endings, and Dvoretzky's Endgame Manual are 3 endgame books that I would highly recommend. If you want to go check those out, you can do that. But hope you enjoyed the video today.